right. Welcome back to the Bookly Podcast. And this week's episode is Animal Farm by George Orwell. And I'm really excited about this episode of the podcast because George Orwell really was what got me excited to read again for the first time, in 16 years when I read 1984 about a year ago. And so he's kind of the literary inspiration for me that really got me going in kind of this journey to read more. And really what showed me that reading can be fun, it can be educational, it can be eye-opening, and it can be, a really great experience for you. And so I've been really excited to read Animal Farm for a while. And Animal Farm is great, and we'll dive into it here in just a sec. But I did also want to say, for those of you who are starting to worry a little bit that the podcast is going to end up being just me on every episode alone, that hopefully it won't be like that forever. I am still trying to get more and more guests to come on to the podcast. It is just a little bit hard to get people to travel up to Idaho, and Idaho is kind of in the middle of nowhere. Idaho Falls is even more in the middle of nowhere, and so getting guests can be a little bit difficult here. What I will say is that next week we are going to be doing the Empire of the Summer Moon, and it will be our first remote episode of the podcast. So we're going to have Adam on the podcast. He's going to be kind of remote calling in, and we've got him a nicer mic, so it should still sound, high quality, which was my biggest concern when doing the remote podcast. Was I just wanted to keep the quality of the quality of the product as high as possible for the consumer, for you guys, the listeners. And so we ended up getting a mic. We're going to test this whole thing out, and we're going to do a remote podcast next week. If all goes well, I now will have access to mics in Utah and in Alaska. And so we can bring on guests from really wherever, and we can do a little bit more remote. And then anybody who also has access to a mic, who might be a guest on other podcasts or a host of other podcasts, or is just interested in coming on the podcast, this will kind of open the doors for more guests, because I do feel like the two-person conversation about books is great. And it's actually my preferred method, because as much as I love to just sit in front of a camera and monologue for an hour, it is a lot more difficult than it seems. One, because I make it look so easy, of course. But two, I feel like the product is not as, I just don't like it as much. I like that in the two-person conversations, I can learn as well. Like, I learn about the other person's perspective. They, have their own unique experiences. And then on top of that, we can get, higher, I don't want to say higher quality, but maybe more specialized guests for specific books. Then we can bring on, more knowledge, more, nuanced opinions to some of these books that we have scheduled throughout 2024. And so it gives us an opportunity to do that, hopefully with the remote episode. So everybody who's interested, tune in next week. We'll see how it goes. I'm a little bit nervous, but I've got my fingers crossed that we can keep the quality high, that we can keep the experience high, that the conversation doesn't lag at all. And if all goes well, we'll be recording a few more remote podcasts this year, and then you won't have to listen to me just come up and monologue for an hour. But if you like that, then you're in for a doozy this week, because this week's episode, man, Animal Farm was great. I really, really liked it. And this wasn't the first time that I have been introduced to Animal Farm. In, I believe it was 9th or 10th grade. I can't remember. I can't remember the teacher. I want to say 9th, mostly because my 9th grade teacher hated me with like every fiber of her being. And she hated me because I hated reading. And that was just our relationship. She would recommend books, and I would maybe politely, not so politely, basically say that reading's for losers and that I didn't want anything to do with those books. And so in 9th grade, we were assigned Animal Farm as one of the books that we had to read, and I spark noted the whole thing. So I spark noted my way throughout high school. I spark noted my way through I mean, I don't even know that I had to use SparkNotes in college, to be completely honest, because I'm going to say this and I'll say it multiple times on the podcast. I think college and secondary education is an absolute joke unless you're going in for a very specific reason. If you're going in to go to like a STEM field or you're going into like medicine, then it's awesome. Other than that, secondary education, in my opinion, is such a terrible benchmark for knowledge because you get exactly what you put into it. And so if your only purpose in going to, university or college is just to get that piece of paper so that you can get interviews later in life, you can do that putting in zero effort. I was able to get through my degree, my bachelor's program, a bachelor's in economics, literally learning nothing. I, would write essays and I would just basically regurgitate what I knew professors wanted to hear. And I think throughout my entire 4-year degree, I don't think I was required to read a single book cover to cover. I know the closest I got was I took a business foundations class where we read excerpts of books, and I actually read every excerpt of every book because I loved the professor and he made the discussion really, really fun. So that was the most I've read, and it wasn't even cover to cover books. It was just, small sections of different books written by, tons of different business minds from, Adam Smith to, Rockefeller to, Karl Marx to really, anybody. I mean, it was all over the place, but it was a business introduction class and it was very interesting. And I actually enjoyed it because of how much I think I read. I didn't realize that in the moment, but looking back on it now, I think the reason why I enjoyed that class was because of the reading. Like I actually enjoyed it. But in high school, I made fun of those kids that enjoyed it. I just thought it was so lame to like reading. And I mean, there were just so much cooler things you could be doing. You could be going out and skiing. Why read when you could ski? I mean, that was my whole like persona in high school. And because of that, my teacher hated me, absolutely hated me. And so I remember getting through the spark notes of this book and being like, man, what a dumb book. I can vividly remember that. Like, I remember finishing the spark notes and being like, the pigs talk to the humans at the end. This book is so dumb. And man, I feel bad for 14-year-old Brandon, who's just judging this book through the spark notes and just not giving it a chance, because this book is honestly, I mean, it's amazing. At the time when it was written, 1945, I believe, is when it was originally published. It was 4 years before 1984. So it was, 1984 was 1949. So this book would have been 1945. I mean, it was prophetic, honestly, this book was. It was amazing to see somebody break down kind of the ideas of like totalitarian rule into such a basic and such a understandable format that is the fairy tale of Animal Farm, with these animals that rise up to revolution and overthrow the evil Farmer Jones. Like what an inspired and, really like, I mean, crucial piece of literature that I feel like doesn't get the respect that it deserves to a 14-year-old. And that's one of my biggest beefs, I think, with kind of the education system, is that this book really has so much power to both, teach about, governments, to teach about power, to teach about the relationships between individuals, to teach about history. I mean, this entire book it's a allegory for the Russian Revolution. And me as a 14-year-old, if you had asked me, true or false, did Russia go through a revolution? You would have gotten the answer. I would have gotten the answer right 50%. I would have had a 50-50 chance of getting that answer right, because it would have been a complete guess, because I didn't know anything. And so like introducing these books to kids is great because, again, it breaks some of these themes down in a very easy to digest method. But at the same time, without the historical background of Joseph Stalin's rise to power, and without the historical background of like how incredibly awful that time of history was, then you don't really appreciate the book that is Animal Farm. And so I wanted to take just a quick second to kind of go over a little bit of the research that I did about kind of the Russian Revolution and some of the like themes and things that I think kind of paint a good picture for paint a good picture for what makes Animal Farm so important as a historical text. And then, at the end, I kind of want to talk about what makes Animal Farm such a important text for like current reflection, if that makes sense. So for those of you who haven't spent a whole lot of time studying the Russian Revolution, what I will say is it should be taught in schools. So in high school, you learn about World War I, you learn about World War II. You learn, stuff about the Roman Empire. World history starts with like ancient Egyptians, the Roman Empire, Greeks. Then you go into like, the Austro-Hungarian kind of empire. You go into like Ottomans and all sorts of things. You learn everything. And the one thing that you don't really learn anything about is Russia. I don't really understand. You learn a little bit about the Cold War and basically that there were nukes pointed at each other and we didn't like each other. And that's where all of the spy movies come from. That was I'm honestly not joking. That was the extent of my knowledge of Russia pre this research about a week ago, when I was like, you know what, I should probably bone up on my Russian history before I go in and read this book. And it was really eye-opening, I would say, because just even reading through some of the kind of historical events, I began to realize like I knew nothing. Zero, zilch, squat, nothing about Russia at all. Nothing about kind of the power struggle, nothing about the history, nothing about, when I say nothing, I mean like literally nothing. I know that they, flipped, or they were, back and forth in World War II on, allies with Hitler and then not allies with Hitler and then all sorts of things. And then, the creation of the Soviet Union. And then basically I know that we beat them in hockey in like 1980 at the Olympics. And then it was all downhill from there. That's all I've got. That's my extent of my knowledge of Russia. And so just kind of going over some of the kind of craziness that happened with Russia. So this book, Animal Farm, kind of deals with two major Russian characters throughout the Russian Revolution, or actually a couple different characters of the Russian Revolution. So, but primarily it is an allegory of Stalinism. So it's an allegory of Joseph Stalin and his reign over kind of throughout the Bolshevik Revolution, and then into, how Stalin ruled across the Soviet Union. So as Stalin was ruler, and I won't really go into him early on because, again, I'm still learning this. I really want to read more books and do a little bit more research into the history of Russia because I feel like it's really important to understand history, again, so you don't repeat it. Anybody, any country at any time can repeat history without a proper understanding of where others failed. And so it's important to understand these things. But essentially, under Stalin, there were, it was just about as bad as you could get. You kind of always think that, kind of like Nazi Germany becomes like the enemy number one of all, of all filmed and, everything. You've got evil Germans and Die Hard and whatnot. But, Russia really was, Stalin's Russia was awful. What an awful time to live. So he would, he performed mass executions and mass exiles on basically anybody who didn't cooperate with his orders. This really included and like particularly went after farmers who owned land and didn't cooperate with basically his authoritarian socialism agenda. And because of that, it led to widespread famine across the Soviet Union. And he had a secret police similar to Nazi Germany. He encouraged citizens to spy on each other, similar to Nazi Germany. He had many people sent to the Gulag system, which were forced labor and concentration camps, again, similar to Nazi Germany. And then in like the second half of his kind of reign over Russia, he instituted what was called the Great Purge, which was a series of campaigns that were designed basically to get rid of the Communist Party and other military parts of Soviet society that he considered to be a threat to his power. And it was just basically just mass murder at that point. Again, it was sending people to the Gulag system and widespread exile and executions. And it is believed that throughout his kind of reign, he was responsible for somewhere between 6 million and 20 million people are estimated to have killed somewhere between 6 and 20 million people, either through direct execution or indirectly through his policies that caused people, to starve, mass impoverishment, crazy time in history. He also, I think a lot of what George Orwell talked about in his books was taken from both the Nazi Party and the Soviet Union, because he also, would change history books and, basically rewrite the past in order to kind of self-promote himself as kind of this person that was bigger than life and had a much more important role throughout the history of Russia than he actually had. Again, he was going through and rewriting history and rewriting himself into history. It was a crazy time. A couple quotes from Joseph Stalin that I found kind of haunting. The first one is, I consider it completely unimportant who in the party will vote or how, but what is extremely important is who will count the votes and how. Definitely authoritarian. And then the next one, ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why would we let them have ideas? Yeah. Crazy individual. So again, just scratching the surface as far as the kind of the history behind this time period and behind Joseph Stalin. But I feel like it's important because, again, I just keep going back to 14-year-old me sitting down in class, not having any desire to read this book, or, finishing up the Spark Noted version of Animal Farm and just being like, well, that was dumb. When in actuality, if schools spent a little bit more time teaching history and the importance of history, as well as kind of the historical events that, I don't know, maybe the historical events that would be and how they, I don't know. I feel like there's got to be a better way to get kids involved into history to make books like this more important for them. Because everybody that I talk to who's read Animal Farm basically says, oh, read it in high school. That's, haven't read it since. And they have no plan or no intention to read it again. And I just feel like this book, although interesting, probably lacks a lot of power, a lot of oomph that it would get with a proper understanding of the history behind Russia, the history behind Stalin, the history behind, Leon Trotsky, the history behind the Tsars, all of that kind of paints the picture that makes these animals, these pigs, important. So that's my 2 cents about history. That's why I never read it in high school. That's why I thought it was dumb in high school. And that's why I'm completely changing my tune today, because today I think this book is amazing. And I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I enjoyed it way more than I thought I would. And to me, it was a great precursor to 1984. I feel like 1984 takes a lot of the ideas of Animal Farm and expounds on them and kind of develops them into like this dystopian future. Whereas 1984, it's a very short book. It's probably, I don't know exactly what it is. I'm sure it's right here. It's 128 pages. I was about to say it's like 3 hours, 3.5 hours on Audible. It's pretty quick and it moves very quickly. The pacing of the book is great, but it doesn't expound on any of these ideas very well. And I feel like that's what George Orwell did in 1984. He took a lot of the concepts that he touched on in Animal Farm, and he really just built a future around it in 1984. So if you enjoyed 1984, this is like a great precursor, a great quick read for that. If you've never read either, I would recommend starting with Animal Farm and then going into 1984. And if you haven't read Animal Farm since high school and you thought it was dumb in high school, just like I did, then please reread it. And reread it with like a fresh set of eyes. Spend like 2 seconds watching some YouTube videos about the history of Russia, the history of Joseph Stalin, read some quick facts, and then go through and read this book, because I think you'll gain a much deeper appreciation for this book, what George Orwell was able to do with this story, and also just the importance overall of this book. So I want to start off, again, before we dive into the story, reading the Audible version of the summation, or not the Audible, the Goodreads version of the summation. And then I'm going to read Wikipedia, because Wikipedia I think is way easier to understand. So we're going to start with Goodreads. So this is what Goodreads says about Animal Farm. A farm is taken over by its overworked, mistreated animals. With flaming idealism and stirring slogans, they set out to create a paradise of progress, justice, and equality. Thus, the stage is set for one of the most telling satiric fables ever penned, a razor-edged fairy tale for grown-ups that record the evolution from revolution against tyranny to totalitarianism, just as terrible. When Animal Farm was first published, Stalinist Russia was seen as the target. Today it is devastatingly clear that wherever and whenever freedom is attacked, under whatever banner, the cutting clarity and savage comedy of George Orwell's masterpiece have a meaning and a message still ferociously fresh. All right. I hate all of those adjectives and adverbs. It's like ferociously fresh and devastatingly clear. And, I don't know. I don't like that. So I feel like it's a little diluted. So I'm going to read the Wikipedia entry because I just feel like it's better. So Animal Farm is a beast fable in the form of satirical, allegorical novella by George Orwell. First published in England on the 17th of August, 1945, it tells a story of a group of anthropomorphic farm animals who rebel against their human farmer, hoping to create a society where animals can be equal, free, and happy. Ultimately, the rebellion is betrayed under the dictatorship of a pig named Napoleon. The farm ends up in a state as bad as it was before. So that's the book. So just wanted to kind of go over a little bit of the book in kind of chronological order here. And then I have some questions here at the end that I think were very interesting. So essentially what happens is there's a farmer, Farmer Jones, and he runs this farm. And he runs this farm just like any other farmer runs this farm. He, works his animals in the fields, and he, milks the cows, and he takes the milk and he uses, he takes some of it and he drinks some of it and gives some to his family and he sells the rest. He makes the chickens lay eggs. He takes the eggs, he eats the eggs. How dare this farmer do that? But that is mean, bad Farmer Jones taking from the animals. So the animals get together and they realize that none of their work or none of their effort is going directly back into them as animals, and that they're basically being taken advantage of, and that they've got these freeloading humans that are taking all of their work and all of their creation for themselves and not giving it back to the animals. So they're like, man, this is awful. And so what we're going to do is we're going to stage a rebellion. And this rebellion is going to create an opportunity for animals to live free. And so pretty quickly after the idea of this rebellion is given to the animals, and just so that you're aware before going into this book, the animals can talk. They can also use pencils. They can also walk around. They can also, have full formed ideas. They can, talk and work with humans. They can sell foods. They can create windmills. And it's a fairy tale. And I think the original title for the book was actually it had fairy tale in the title. I want to say it was like Animal Farm, the original title was Animal Farm, a fairy story. And so it was meant to be a fairy story. That was the idea. It was supposed to be a fairy story with a political motive attached behind it that was also an allegory for the Soviet Revolution or the Russian Revolution. And so a lot of this is not supposed to be it's supposed to be kind of fun. It's supposed to be kind of magical, and it's supposed to be kind of fantastic in the way that the story is told. So don't let that detract from the actual story, because as a 14-year-old, it did for me. I was like, this is so dumb. The pig's walking around with a piece of chalk in his hand. That's stupid. But that's the way it's supposed to be. And so these animals get together and they realize again that they can do this. And so they have this meeting, they have this idea for this revolution, and then it happens one day. It kind of organically starts to spin out of control, and they kick Jones and the rest of the family out of the farm. They take over the farm. They change the name of the farm from the Jones Manor from the Manor, I think is what it is, to Animal Farm is now the name of the farm. And they basically establish rule by animals for animals, and they call this ideology animalism. So animalism is kind of the idea that they set up, and they don't really know what animalism is at first. They have this big meeting in the barn, and everybody's kind of asking questions. They're like, the horse wants to know if it can still wear bows in its hair, and they want to know what they're supposed to do with the house, that the human house that's on the field, and they want to know, they're asking all these quote stupid questions is what people were saying. But it's kind of these pigs that rise up to the occasion and start leading the ideas of Animal Farm and kind of come up with the practices of animalism. So the first step is to get rid of all of the tools used by humans. They get rid of all the whips, they get rid of all the bridles, the nose ring, all of the nose bags, ribbons, and anything that was a sign of animals being ruled over by humans. They get rid of it completely. The next thing that they do is they celebrate. They basically eat what they call a double ration of food for the day. They do an inspection of all of their land, and all of the animals look around and are basically in love with the land for the first time in their lives. So they see the land for what it is now, which is the fruit. It's endless possibilities for them, essentially. So instead of being a working field, it is now a land of opportunities where all the energy that they put into the land, now they get to reap 100% of the benefits themselves, which is great. And they happy about it. So then they go through, they wake up the next day and they're like, okay, we need to get a little bit more established here as a farm. So we're going to come up with these commandments. And these are the commandments that they create initially. And that is, whatever goes upon 2 legs is an enemy. Whatever goes upon 4 legs or has wings or is a friend, or has wings is a friend. No animal shall wear clothes. No animal shall sleep in a bed. No animal shall drink alcohol. No animal shall kill any other animal. And then lastly, all animals are equal. So, essentially, they get excited about this whole idea. Everybody's equal, and they're excited that in their eyes, without these parasitic humans, without these humans that just leech after everything that they create, that each one of them is going to be able to eat more, and that they're going to be able to prosper more, and that the work is going to be so much more fulfilling because they're going to be working for themselves as individuals instead of for me and Mr. Jones. So they establish a new flag, which is a hoof and a horn, which is pretty funny because it's the hammer and the sickle, I think that's what it is in Russia, in the Soviet Union. But yeah, a hoof and a horn as the flag. And then they're working, and then pretty quickly after this is all established, this is when it all starts to go downhill. So the pigs eventually, so they have meetings it's either every week or every night. I can't remember what it is, but they have meetings pretty regularly in the barn to discuss things. And in these discussions, usually not a lot happens, and they're usually not all too vital. Everybody's pretty excited to work hard because, again, they have this feeling of entitlement of and ownership of the land. So everybody wants to work hard. Nobody's sitting around resting on their laurels. Everybody's getting out early. They're excited to bring in the harvest. They're excited to work. And then they go into these meetings and they're having these discussions, and not a lot is happening. And really what slowly happens is that the pigs start dominating these conversations. So these pigs start dominating the conversations, and there are 2 pigs specifically that basically oppose each other throughout all of the meetings, and they talk back and forth, and that is Snowball and Napoleon. And they essentially dictate most of what goes on. And the pigs become like the unelected, just kind of slide in naturally into kind of the leaders of the farm. And eventually what happens is that the pigs convince everyone that they need more milk and they need to eat the ripest apples because they're thinking, and the thinking is the most beneficial thing to the whole community. And there's a quote here that I found really interesting. And it is kind of the pig's rationalization for kind of needing these apples. And he says, "Comrades," he cries, you do not imagine, I hope, that we pigs are doing this in spirit of selfishness and privilege. Many of us actually dislike milk and apples. I dislike them myself. Our sole object in taking these things is to preserve our health. Milk and apples, this has been proven by science, comrades, contain substance absolutely necessary to the well-being of a pig. We pigs are brain workers. The whole management and organization of this farm depends on us. Day and night, we are watching over your welfare. It is for your sake that we drink the milk and eat those apples. Yeah, kind of rationalizing that decision pretty hard. But that's what happens, and these pigs become the leaders, especially these 2 pigs, Napoleon and Snowball. And there are kind of 2 different factions within these pigs. Snowball wants to build a giant windmill that is going to generate electricity, that then the electricity can be used to assist the animals in their labors, and it will also, give comfort and, electricity. He's like, one of the things he mentions is that every stall will have a light bulb in it, and that we will be able to do our work faster, and animals will only have a 3-day work week, but we will still be able to harvest just as much food, which means everybody's going to still be able to eat more than they did back with Mr. Jones, and they're only going to have to work 3 days a week, and you'll have light. And he's kind of pitching the dream with this windmill. And then on the other side of things, Napoleon essentially just opposes him at all odds, isn't really a big fan of this windmill. And then there is essentially this meeting. And this meeting comes to a head because it's the meeting that decides whether the farm is going to build the windmill or not. And in this meeting, Napoleon gives this giant speech about how great the windmill is. And again, he wins over all of the farm into this idea of the 3-hour work week and having so much abundance in their farming. And at the end of the meeting, Napoleon whistles, essentially. I don't know what he does. He makes a noise, whistles, and these giant dogs burst into the barn, and they chase Snowball out of the farm, and he takes over as the sole thinker of Animal Farm. And it's basically just a violent insurrection, a violent revolution that leads to Napoleon being the sole leader of Animal Farm, unelected. And that just begins the downhill that is Animal Farm. So from there, Napoleon decides that it actually would be beneficial to build the windmill. And so he essentially forces everybody to build this windmill. And they go through a couple iterations of this windmill because it gets destroyed, and then they build it up again, and it gets destroyed, and they build it up again. And because of their kind of fixation on this windmill, the harvest isn't going great. And because the harvest isn't going great, the animals are starting to eat less food than they had. Their rations are being halved. In addition to that, the pigs are taking more and more of the food that's available, and they are, they're basically lying to the rest of the animals the entire time. And another quote that I really liked comes from this section here, when some of the animals start to question why Napoleon is making all of these decisions. And this is the quote. It says, "No one believes more firmly than Comrade Napoleon that all animals are equal. He would be only too happy to let you make your decisions yourselves. But sometimes you might make the wrong decisions, comrades. Then where would we be?" And that's kind of the scare tactic that Napoleon uses throughout the entire book. He constantly relies on fear of Mr. Jones coming back as his ability to kind of allow him to make any decision that he wants. So all of the animals believe that they have to follow Napoleon, because if they don't follow Napoleon, Mr. Jones is going to come back. And times were just so bad with Mr. Jones. At least we're not dead. At least it's better now. At least it's better now. Even when their rations are being halved, or even when they're, being worked super hard on this windmill, the entire time, all they think of is well, at least it's better than when Mr. Jones was here. And then the pigs start breaking all of the commandments. So one of the commandments was no animal shall sleep in a bed. One of the first things that the pigs do after Napoleon rises to power is they move back into the home of Mr. Jones, and they start sleeping in the beds. And so a couple of the animals start to question this, and they go back and they look at all the commandments, and the pigs have actually changed the commandments. So the new commandment says, "No animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets." And this goes on for every commandment. So, no animal shall drink alcohol. All of the pigs decide that it's okay to drink alcohol, and they change the commandment to "No animal shall drink alcohol in excess," or "No animal shall kill another animal without cause," because Snowball ends up killing anybody that said anything against him, or anybody that he saw as a threat to power. He ends up killing them, and sicking the dogs after them. So, and the entire time, all of the rest of the animals on the farm are basically just being gaslit into thinking that those were always the commandments, that Napoleon didn't change the commandments. That's what they always were. And so every time he kind of steps over a commandment, he changes it, and then he goes back and he changes history. And he says, no. This is what the commandments have always been. It always said no animals shall sleep in a bed without sheets, and we sleep with blankets, not sheets. So it's totally fine. And this kind of keeps, going and going and going to the point where, animals are starving, animals are being overworked. The windmill eventually gets finished, and he doesn't even use it for helping with production. He's using it for other purposes. He ends up selling some of the products or some of the production of the animals to other farms. He lies about the production to all of the animals. He's constantly telling the animals, production for the farm is up 300%, even though all of them are having to cut their rations. And everything is worse than it was before. And everybody pretty much just gives up on their original dream of the 3-hour work week. And these animals are basically beaten into submission and forced into submission through threat of death, through threat of like the dogs. And the original dream of that 3-hour work week was given up and denounced. And in the book, it says that true happiness was to embrace animalism at its core. And then Napoleon does like the final kind of, I always think of it as like the Orwellian change, but like the final revision of history. And he says that animalism at its core is to work hard and live frugally. And that's it. And it was never, animalism at the beginning was, all about equality and all about, living off of the fruits of your own labor. But in the end, what happened through this totalitarian rule of Napoleon was he changed everything to the point where he even changed the fundamental ideas that the animals fought for originally. And they all believed him by the end, that the true purpose of animalism was to just work hard and live frugally. And then the final scene of the book, the pigs now walk upright on 2 legs. They carry whips around and, beat the other animals into submission. And the animals, so the final scene is then the pigs go into the house and they are playing cards with humans, and they are basically interchangeable with the humans. The animals can't distinguish between the pigs and the humans because they are the exact same. And the humans are actually asking the pigs, how did you get your animals to work so hard? Your animals work harder and work for less food than any of our animals on our farms. And the pigs just laugh. And that's the end of the book. So the farm actually ends up in a worse condition than it started off on. So that is a quick breakdown of kind of the path of Animal Farm and the history, and really the allegory of the history of the Russian Revolution. And you can kind of see similarities there, even in just the small themes that I spoke of earlier in the podcast, where, you had basically the forced concentration camps, you had the alteration of history, you had executions, you had famine, and you had, kind of this like building up or almost worship of this dictator who didn't have the best interests of the people at heart, the people who originally thought through this revolution that they were going to be working for themselves. The idea of kind of this socialist revolution is that the people and the farmers were going to be finally working, for themselves and getting the fruits of their labor. And none of that actually ended up coming into pass. And what ended up happening because of the totalitarianism was a worse version of what they had originally tried to overthrow. So because in the Russian Revolution, what they overthrew was the Tsar, or basically like the king, the monarchy at that time. And what they ended up doing was they ended up actually overthrowing him and establishing something even worse through like an unintentional corruption of power through one individual. And in Russia, that individual was Stalin. In the book, that individual was Napoleon. So I think that this book is very important. And I think if for any reason this book would be controversial, what I would say is it's probably controversial just because of the idea of, I don't know, the corruption of power in general, because people in power don't like to think that they're corrupt, but I mean, I don't know. I think that there are a lot of similarities between a lot of elected officials and, current democratic government processes and authoritarian states. And I think that if you take a good hard look at both, you'll see that there are definitely aspects of authoritarianism in all governments. And that is kind of the piece about Orwell that really makes you think and really makes you kind of introspective into like, how can we get away from that? Because the authoritarian side of things always leads down a terrible path. And that's kind of the history that you want to not repeat, is the authoritarian rule. So if I had to say anything about the US government, I would say we're definitely not an authoritarian state, but I would say, there might be some authoritarian tendencies in there. And so when kind of thinking about this podcast, I thought, what might be kind of interesting is to run this all by AI. So I went into ChatGPT and I typed in the 10 signs that you might be living in an authoritarian state. And this to me seems like some sort of, BuzzFeed quiz, like 10 signs your government might be cheating on you. But these were the 10 answers that ChatGPT gave me. And I'd like to run through it so that you can kind of maybe introspectively think about kind of where we are as a society, where other societies are, where other governments are, and kind of, how close we mimic some of these signs that we live in an authoritarian state. So 1, limited political freedoms. Citizens have restricted or limited political freedoms, such as the right to freely express opinions, assemble, or participate in political activities without fear of reprisal. A little interesting there. Censorship and media and controlled media. The government tightly controls media outlets with censorship and restrictions on information and disinformation. Independent journalism is suppressed and state-controlled narratives dominate. Political repression. Number 3. Opposition parties, activists, and dissenting voices are systematically suppressed. Political opposition may face harassment, imprisonment, or even violence as a means to quash dissent. Number 4, manipulated elections. Elections are not free and fair, with instances of voter manipulation, electoral fraud, and limited choices for citizens. The ruling party maintains control through questionable electoral practices. Arbitrary rule of law. The rule of law is arbitrary and often used as a tool for political repression. Legal systems may lack independence, and selective enforcement of laws is used to target perceived enemies of the state. Surveillance state. Number, 6? Widespread surveillance is employed by the government to monitor citizens' activities. There is very limited privacy. Citizens may fear surveillance in both public and private spheres. Military influence on civilian affairs. Number 6. Number 7. The military plays a significant role in civilian affairs. There may be a militarization of key institutions. Civilian decision-making is influenced or overridden by the military. 8. Limited freedom of assembly. The right to assemble peacefully is restricted, and public gatherings are tightly controlled. Protests or demonstrations against the government are met with swift and harsh measures. Number 9, cult of personality. A single leader or ruling elite is glorified through a cult of personality. The leader is often portrayed as infallible, and dissent or criticism against them is not tolerated. And number 10, limited civil liberties. Citizens face restrictions on basic civil liberties, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right of privacy. Individuals may be punished for expressing views contrary to those of the ruling authority. And then there's a little note here from ChatGPT that says, it is important to note that these signs may vary in intensity, and the presence of one or more does not necessarily categorize a state as entirely authoritarian. Additionally, political context can change, and the status of the state may evolve over time. These signs provide a general overview of characteristics often associated with authoritarian states. So, when I read those, I saw a lot of similarities to governments all over the world. I mean, the United States, Canada, basically anywhere in Europe. I mean, anything. I mean, China. Everywhere. There were definitely pieces and parts of a lot of these signs in a lot of different governments across the world. Again, I want to go through these. Here are 10 signs. So wait, I want to go over these one more time. So here are 10 signs that you might be living in an authoritarian state, according to ChatGPT. Limited political freedoms, censorship and controlled media, political repression, manipulated elections, arbitrary rule of law, surveillance state, military influence in civilian affairs, limited freedom of assembly, cult of personality, and limited civil liberties. I think there are aspects of those in both sides of the aisle. And I think that it is more a problem of large government than one-sided government or the other-sided government. I think that there is definitely a state that exists that allows for one side or the other to use kind of an authoritarian tendency. I don't want to call it an authoritarian state because I don't think we live in an authoritarian state, but I think there are authoritarian tendencies to control and maintain power through a limited election. I think there are a lot of, career-long and, politician instated bureaucrats throughout all of the government that definitely fall into some of these categories. So I think it's important to look at that. And I think that Animal Farm gives us a very, very, good allegory and a very, very good example of some of the pitfalls and also some of the, eventual consequences of continuing to allow a ruling class to kind of build upon their authority. And so if you give somebody an inch, they'll take 2 inches. You give somebody 2 inches, they'll take, 5 inches. And then eventually they'll take the whole thing. And that's what ended up happening with Napoleon. And that's what can end up happening with really, and I think that's the message that George Orwell wants to give us in both this book and in 1984 is essentially like that if you give people that initial first step, if you give people a little bit of extra milk and a couple extra apples, that is only the start of people taking to the point where they can justify anything because of who they are. In the end, the pigs were able to justify anything because they felt like they were the only ones that could think for Animal Farm. They were the only ones who could see what was best for the farm, that it was what was best for the farm always. And they ended up justifying that. And I think that's true for anybody who gets caught in these kind of authoritarian spirals, I would say, is originally the intention was good. The intention of, setting up a democracy and allowing the people to vote and allowing people to choose elected officials and to, have a limited ability for rulership, because prior to kind of the great experiment of the United States, everything was, either an individual or a small group of individuals that made all of the decisions. There were dictatorships, or they were kings, or there were, oligarchies, or, religious oligarchies. That was how people were ruled. And the great experiment of the United States was to kind of push back against that, remove the ability for authoritarians to kind of push their will downward. And, I think as we give up more and more of those liberties and more of that original purpose and goal behind creating a democratic republic, then we fall closer and closer and closer to these warning signs of an authoritarian state. And again, I think we're slowly seeing kind of authoritarian tendencies creep up even in our country today. And I think it's a good wake up call, Animal Farm is, to the potential loss of everything. The animals lost everything. They even lost their ism. They lost animalism in the end. They lost their driving purpose, their goal. I mean, animalism at the beginning of the story was kind of this pure intent of all animals being equal. And by the end of the story, animalism was work hard and live frugally. And so if we don't cherish and protect kind of the American ideals that were originally established through the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, then, we give up those ideals for more authoritarian individuals who say that they know better than us, who these civil servants like Napoleon, they don't want to take the apples, they don't want to take the milk, but they have to, because that's just the way it works, and that it'll be better for you in the end. They don't want to take all your money, they don't want to take all your freedoms, but in the end, it's going to be better for you. You're going to be happier, you're going to be safer. And that is kind of the path towards that authoritarian state. So I think it's a very, very important book that people need to kind of revisit and look at with fresh eyes, and also with the kind of the lens of history, and understand what the original purpose of America was, or the original purpose of Canada, or wherever you're from, England, with the original purpose of establishing these safety nets, or establishing these communities of freedom. And then take a look at where we are now and see how far we've fallen from that, so that we can push back and get back to that original purpose, which was freedom and equality, and the ability to thrive, which is what the animals were originally fighting for. I think that's important, that you don't lose that original purpose and desire. So that was really what I wanted to talk about here with Animal Farm. I really enjoyed Animal Farm, and it was fun. That's the other thing, is with a little bit of historical context, I think it is a great way for younger kids, for high school kids, and for college kids to understand the dangers that we face as a political system. And I know I said earlier that it was a dumb book to assign to a bunch of 14-year-olds, but I don't think it would be a dumb book to assign to a bunch of 17-year-olds, seniors in high school, about to learn, or about to be able to exercise their freedom to vote, and their, starting to learn about, the consequences of their political decisions. I think it's important that you take that time to really understand that there's definitely upside of political parties, but there's also downside to political parties. And it's important to weigh the consequences, as well as the good consequences and the bad consequences of those decisions. And so if I was to give any advice to my high school teacher, it would be hold off on Animal Farm when you're 14 and you don't understand anything and all you want to do is ski, and reintroduce it when you're 17 or 18 years old, getting ready to really learn about, again, the consequences of political parties and the consequences of your elected officials and the consequences of your vote personally, because every vote, should count, and everybody should think about what's going to happen with determined, who you vote for, and how these decisions, both, locally, nationally, or internationally, going to affect your life and your freedoms, because essentially, you're giving up some of your freedom through giving it to other people. So I think that's important, and Animal Farm's just a really good, clean, quick, easy to understand example of where that can lead with, the incorrect individuals and with kind of a blind following of an individual over, the collective good of the farm. So really, really enjoyed it. I would give it a 5 and a 5. Honestly, I'd put it right up there with, a lot of my other favorite books that I read last year. I think it's a 5 for fun. Again, the fairy tale aspect of it makes it kind of fun. The characters are fun. The animals are kind of fun. They're walking around on 2 legs, holding chalk, drawing windmills. Makes it kind of fun and imaginative while you're reading. And then the overall lessons, I think, can't be understated. There are lessons that I think are going to be important throughout all of history. They're important now. They were important 50 years ago, and I think they're going to be important 500 years from now. And I think books like this are just important pieces of literature that need to be revisited, not frequently, but every once in a while. So if you're somebody who hasn't, again, read Animal Farm within the last year, I would say, hey, maybe it's time to pick it up and give it another shot, because I think it will surprise you how much more you get from this book reading it now as an adult, now as somebody who can see the consequences of political parties, and then, compared to somebody who's 14 years old and doesn't really understand anything. How can you understand anything? You're 14 years old. That's what I don't get. This book, lost on 14-year-olds, and lost on 14-year-old Brandon for sure. So I am glad that I reread this book, and I would highly, highly recommend it. And I think that's everything that I've got for Animal Farm. So if you liked this episode of the podcast, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe on YouTube. At a bare minimum, like and subscribe. It takes like 2 seconds to do that, and it really helps out the whole channel as a whole. If you subscribe to the channel on YouTube, or just give us a like on this video, it helps with the algorithm. It helps boost us, helps us get a little more recognized on the interwebs. And then if you are on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, if you could leave us a 5-star review. We're starting to collect those 5-star reviews. If you don't know how to give us a 5-star review, just scroll to the bottom of your screen and it should say leave a review. Go ahead and just give us, the 5 stars. You can, type something out if you want about how great this is and how you've been rekindled your love for reading, or you found a new book that you want to read, or whatever it is. Just leave us a 5-star review. That'd be great. Again, helps out with everything. And we are getting more active on social medias. So follow us on Instagram. I'm going to be working on TikTok this week. As much as I hate that I said that out loud, I am going to be trying to work on TikTok a bit, just because that's where the people are. But we are on Instagram. Reels started dropping this week. We had a funny one drop today. We made a couple more funny ones. So hopefully you'll enjoy some of the content that we put out. It's a little bit more short form. And it has clips of the podcast, some of, my favorite moments from the podcast. And so make sure that you give us a follow and, like some of our videos. That'd be great. And stay tuned for next week. Again, we're going to be doing the first remote episode of the podcast. So be ready for that. And if all goes well, then we'll do some more remote episodes. And if you want to be a guest on the podcast, but maybe you're located in Utah, or maybe you're in Alaska, or you're somewhere else in the United States or somewhere else in the world, but you've got a microphone, let me know. Reach out to me either on YouTube or on Instagram or on my website, Instagram, website, or YouTube, and let us know. And we will get you on an episode of the podcast. That'd be great. And thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.